can begin the spotlighting, that would be terrific. Thank you to everyone for joining us today at Loyola Marymount University's Department of Art and Art History's Kaleido LA Speaker Series. And a special thanks to the Dean of the College of Communication and Fine Arts, Dr. Alexander Bryant, and the Dean of the William H. Hannon Library, Dr. Kristen Brennan for sponsoring today's roundtable. The study of art history has long been associated with elitism. Its objects of inquiry have often reflected the tastes and the desires of such patrons. And for much of the field's history, its knowledge producers also came from privilege. Calls to include the material culture of non-elites and to decolonize the history of art are not new. However, the urgency to do so has been heightened in recent years, reflecting the call for racial equality brought to the foreground by the Black Lives Matter movement and the rise of anti-Asian sentiments in America. This roundtable brings together the Dean of Content and Strategy at SmartHistory, Dr. Lauren Kilwright-Eubank, along with Doctors Kristen Brennan and Marika Sardar, and my colleague at LMU, Amanda Herring. We have all partnered with SmartHistory to envision a more equitable and diverse art history through our writing and through our editorial work. We know that our work has had an enormous impact. For example, during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic, when many of our classrooms went online, the platform had over 50 million users. And since then, several art history departments have elected to forego the traditional textbook for SmartHistory's online text, Reframing Art History. I ask that you please welcome our speakers, who will each briefly introduce themselves and their work with SmartHistory. So let us begin first by welcoming Dr. Lauren Kilwright-Eubank. Lauren?
Hi. Am I supposed to pin myself or no? Shameless still like that. Okay. I just wanted to at least mention that I think Kristen Brennan is still maybe struggling to join.
Okay.
But it's very nice to digitally see so many familiar names and faces on Zoom. And thank you to Melody for putting this together and inviting me to participate in this conversation. I think in this portion, I thought I would share a little bit about how I joined with SmartHistory. And as I'm sure maybe for many of you, it was born out of my experiences in the classroom, being in really different situations, teaching hundreds of students in a big survey class, and finding the textbooks weren't either kind of meeting their needs or how I want to teach the class. I should note that my own area of specialization is the Spanish Americas, which is a place that is so often not included in survey classes or textbooks. And so, you know, when I was teaching many years ago, like a 600-person survey class, you know, students were telling me how expensive it was, the textbook, and how overwhelming it was. And of course, there's me being like, oh, I want to throw in the Americas somehow, because this seems really important to what we're talking about. But you know, I had to cobble things together. And so I started looking around online just to see what was out there. This was about, I don't even want to say, 13, 14, 15 years ago. and I came across this amazing thing called SmartHistory, which SmartHistory is now 20 years old, for those who don't know. And, you know, I reached out, and, you know, a few years after that, you know, we finally had a chance to connect. And for about the past decade, I've been kind of lurking around the hallowed digital halls of SmartHistory in one way or another. And really the work that I've done there has been born out of kind of what I would like to see offered in the classroom for my students, or available to many people across the globe. And so just in terms of introduction of how I work with SmartHistory, I had the incredible privilege to, you know, resign from my tenured position to join SmartHistory full time. And I did that knowing that it was a huge privilege, that other people might never be able to do something like that. But it was because the work that I do has always felt incredibly meaningful to me. to connect with people, to be able to share with people very broadly, to, learn from other people, right? Like who am I to be writing about Korean art? I want to hear from somebody who's an expert and learn from them and bring them into the conversation. And I hope that, they feel the same way about the stuff that I do. And so I've always felt Smart History was this radical collaborative. And, and now I have, like I said, this incredible privilege and a responsibility to do that every day and to try to find more ways to, work with other people in whatever many ways, maybe in the Q&A that will come out, but try to find ways to bring new voices, new stories so that however we might be teaching and whatever we might be teaching, we can learn from a lot of different people about a lot of different stories. And so that's a lot of what I do in my day to day and how I connected very briefly with Smart History. So pass it along to the next person.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And thank you for your radical work at Smart History. I'd like to introduce now Dr. Kristen Brennan.
Hi, thanks so much for having us, Mel. This is really a wonderful chance to talk about some of the things we care so much about. I came to Smart History. I'm a contributing editor for East Asia, and my specialty is China, but secondary field is Korea. So I sort of look at all of the different kind of essays along those lines and have created several videos and essays myself along these last few years, but also most importantly, I think, is the textbook that many of us are working on right now, Reframing Art History. And I chose to partner with Smart History because I believe that, really kind of along the lines of what Lauren was just talking about, that we are knowledge workers. We have really a societal duty that goes even beyond the classroom to speak and discuss and teach and learn and really sort of knit together this global community of learners. And I think that that's what so much of us went into art history for in the first place, and also what we look for in terms of the reasons, the outcomes that we're sort of thinking of long term, what we hope that everybody will be able to sort of freely benefit from this. And I think this idea of elevating a broader base of knowledge, not just at academic institutions, but really sharing this work more broadly. That's something that's really, I think, motivating for me. So thank you for having us today.
Thank you, Kristen. Marika, we'd love to hear from you next.
Thanks so much. So my name is Marika Sardar, and I'm a specialist in both South Asian and Islamic art, but my work for Smart History has been on the Islamic art side. And I apologize now for my camera. I'm just going to go ahead and stop the video. But I hope you all can hear me okay. I've been with Smart History for, I guess, a few months now as a fellow for Islamic art. So my original role was to create a series of essays to sort of fill in some gaps in content. But I've invited myself, and Lauren has kindly allowed me to sort of also rethink some of the organization of this part of the Smart History site. And that was something that was really appealing to me about Smart History, and why I was excited to get involved was because within the field of Islamic art, we're constantly having conversations about the definition of our field, how to name it, where it really belongs within the framework of art history. And so having a platform like Smart History, where you're not within a specific part of a book, textbook, and sort of bound in a particular place, there are options to kind of reframe the field and to get our content that would traditionally be under the rubric of Islamic art into different parts of the site, to sort of experiment how to get more content in and to cover different areas than you traditionally see in art history. And I've been working primarily in museums, but do teach, and sort of came to this from partially trying to fill in things I'd wish I'd had on hand for students, but also audiences I meet through my museum work who want to learn more. There are lots of learners who come to Smart History aside from university students, and just being able to contribute to that was very exciting for me.
Thank you so much, Marika. And Amanda, we'd love to hear from you next.
Thanks, Melody. Hi, everybody. So I'm here at LMU. Melody and I are in the same department here at in art history at LMU. I started engaging with Smart History regularly a few years ago when my colleagues in art history and I received a grant from the LMU library to switch over our classes to open access readings and textbooks. And as I was putting together the syllabus for my lower division survey of the starting in Paleolithic through the end of Roman, of Mediterranean and Near East, I found that I kept going back to Smart History. The vast majority of my syllabus was Smart History. And so I'm sorry, I apologize for the sound of my voice. I have preschool germs coming home, so I'm fighting off. And so kept coming back to Smart History. And then sometime later, Lauren invited me to write for Smart History. And I really wanted to do this because I saw firsthand how important it was for my own students to have this access to these great resources online. So finding the time to do this took a little while, but I wrote a few essays on Hellenistic art, which is my specialty. And then recently wrote the chapters on Greek art for the Reframing Art History textbook. So 3 chapters from the beginning of the Iron Age through the end of the Hellenistic. And for me, this was so exciting because it was my chance to promote my own history of Greek art and what I find really important and how I teach it to my students. And for this, art history, Greek art has been a fundamental accepted part of the discipline for so long. And so it's been in desperate need of reevaluation, right? That acceptance of Greek art of being fundamental is, I don't have to fight to get people to appreciate and value Greek art as so many of my other colleagues in art history do. But that means it comes along with a few hundred years of baggage of how it's been studied and who studies it and the way it's looked at. And so my goal in approaching Greek art is that reevaluation of updating how we look at it so that it's relevant in the 21st century.
All right. Thank you, Amanda. And thanks to all of you for all of the hard work that you guys do to put into Smart History. I should also add that I am a contributing writer and the content editor of Southeast Asian material at Smart History. I did not begin writing for Smart History too early on. I knew that I needed to get tenure at LMU. And so this is actually a call for any chairs of departments that are here with us, deans who are here with us, to value the work that your faculty is doing on platforms like Smart History so that it does count towards their tenure application. So prior to reaching tenure, much of my work for Smart History has been as an editor, but now that I have tenure, I'm starting to write more for Smart History. The work that is produced on Smart History, as Amanda, Lauren, Kristen, and Marika have already said, is really changing, some of the systematic issues that we have in Smart History, how it's taught, the curriculum, what gets included. And so the work is important. And the essays themselves go through a rigorous peer editing process. So, and not only that, but I know that what I write for Smart History gets read by many people. I cannot say that for some of the journal articles that I have written, but I'm very proud of my work, for Smart History and reaching students from all over the world, not just in the US, but classrooms that use English texts. So I want to use this time now. I know we don't have very much time together today. So I want to use this time to pose some questions to the group, to Amanda, Lauren, Kristen, and Marika. And then after that, we'll pose questions, or rather we will accept questions from the audience. We'd love to especially hear from teachers who use Smart History, what you want to see. And especially we'd love to hear from students as well. You know, what do you need in your art history curriculum and what do you want to see? But before we do that, I'd love to reconvene the group together, Amanda, Lauren, Kristen, Marika, and I. And I'm going to pose a first question to you. And that question is, how can we create a more equitable art history?
I think I'm on for first to answer this question, so I'll get the ball rolling with it. First off, I think that's a great question. And I think actually it's a question that sits very centrally as a kind of a principle, a foundational principle even of, as I understand, of art history, which is simply that art demands conversation. And I think that that's why many of us are studying art history to begin with. And I think that that's this piece that goes all the way into our everyday society. So for example, in my specialty of Chinese art, I'm always grappling with a lot of different kind of riffs that we're sort of negotiating between. And that for me may be art that's being made and being consumed, being taught, or even otherwise sanctioned in China. And then that we study, which is often to me seemed like two different things. Not always totally different, but maybe even just different perspectives in the present, sort of world, but then also even just historically. And then you couple that with all the differences, the vast differences that we have even just within a classroom. And that's even say at I was teaching formerly was at a private university, and we had very small, very selected groups. And even still within every single class, as we all know, having, taught for many years, the differences between student knowledge and cultural backgrounds and different interests. And this idea that we're trying to do to create this sort of a more equitable art history, we need to be able to have conversations with all of those voices, right? And so this idea, this aim of Smart History, I think is very valiant, this idea of being concerned not just with what students learn, but also how they learn, how we model object-centered conversations through our conversations, through videos, through lots of discussion that is useful in sort of applicable, drawing, sort of basic principles into class. Looking not just at the medium, the digital medium, but the content, the tone, and really we sort of think about these things as we're working through every single essay, every single video, and the kinds of ways that we've experienced learning and also teaching, both kind of at once.
I think those are all really great points, Kristen. And I think what you're saying about, looking to students and also other forms of authority rather than just us is something we're trying to work through in the museum world as well. But I have to say it's moving a little bit more slowly there. So it is, again, exciting to be a part of a project like Smart History. And I would say in my field, thinking about this question of equity, in this particular project, it's been, to my mind, a way to expand geographically what's usually considered part of Islamic art history. That's sort of been my particular slant. This time there are many issues to address for sure within the field, but in particular, you don't tend to see Africa or Southeast Asia represented at all, or even sort of the Gulf region after the initial period of the spread of Islam. So I had hoped originally to expand into all of these other areas to bring a bit more representation to the site that so far has been built along fairly traditional lines. And I was also hoping to connect with scholars, from different regions as well, to bring in a variety of voices. To me, that was part of what this equity question meant. On the practical side, that's certainly had its challenges, and we're still working towards that. But I think that just having that in the back of my mind has really changed how I approach the content here. It would have been very easy to follow a traditional Islamic art kind of syllabus and think, okay, well, this particular, topic on the Mamluk dynasty is missing, but really it was nice to also connect with folks like Melody or Krista Clark, who's looking after Africa, to say, how can we work together across our geographic divides? Because I think it's also important to expand within the study of African art or Southeast Asian art or these other areas to make sure Islamic art is included there, because there are different biases within the study of those regions that cut off certain time periods and certain traditions as well. So that's really been my focus this time around.
Both Kristen and Marika have said this so beautifully. I'm not sure what else I could add, except kind of maybe a little bit about how I've approached what I've worked on, which I think draws upon a lot of what Marika was saying of expanding out our definitions of, for me, it's Greek art, of let's not spend so much time on the Acropolis in Athens, which is very important, right? We need to cover it, but there is so much more out there. So I'm, as I mentioned, I'm a scholar of the Hellenistic world, and I am always trying to promote Hellenistic art as being amazing. It's one of my life missions because it has traditionally been very overlooked, and looking at how the Greek world was part of a much larger interconnected world. It wasn't this isolated society. And so looking at the legacies of like the imperialism of Alexander and his successors and how this moves across the Near East and into Asia, and this interactions of different cultures. So that was one of my big goals with this, is to kind of put that in more of a global context, and also considering Greece as part of a much larger world.
I love all these answers, so I don't want to replicate, so I'll just build off of them, which is to say that I think one of the things that we talk a lot about almost daily at Smart History in terms of how to create a more equitable art history is things like how Smart History is freely available, right, to anyone, provided they have an internet connection. They can come and they can learn, whether that's students in an art history class, whether that's, lifelong learners, and people find us through a lot of different channels, right? And so part of that equity is access. And, some people only watch us on YouTube, some people come to the website. And so I think, much of what motivates us in terms of both content creation and accessibility is trying to do this. So as not to replicate all the wonderful things that everyone just said here, one of the ways that we continue to try to create a more equitable art history is even just trying to form both individual and group and broader connections with people, right? And by that I mean that might mean trying to be in conversation with Indigenous elders, and being very forthright that we don't, deserve their respect right away. That's that trust that has to be built, and that might be many years to kind of make sure that those things are taking place, and inviting them into the conversation and making sure that they feel respected to be able to talk about things versus us talking for them. And so I think that maybe is getting ahead to the second question, but it goes back to the idea of voices, and, not just be, it's not that it's just free, it's also, who's able to kind of participate in these things. The last kind of flip side of that, and this touches on something that Kristen mentioned, is also just making people feel like they're welcome when they come even to the website or when they watch one of our videos, right? I mean, all of us who are art historians know we have some serious jargon that we can throw around. We like to talk about, discourse and, all sorts of big words that in our scholarship might make a lot of sense, but, you put an essay that introduces 10 things that your average 18-year-old has never heard of right there at the beginning of a reading. And they're like, they have clicked away so fast. And so we really try to imagine like what will grab people's attention, but also make them feel welcome. Like what tools can we use in a video or in an essay to make people feel like they can come along for the conversation and they want to learn more, and to get them to click on other things because they feel like they have at least a foothold on some, few important points. And I think that gets to the equity piece too, is not making people feel like they're out of the club, but trying to draw people in so that, our discipline continues to flourish and people see it as important as we all know, that it is.
Thank you. I think everyone's made some really great points, and I echo all of your sentiments. And just to build upon what Lauren just said, I think, those of us who study art history forget that it does feel really clubby at times, right? So I'm thinking about, my own classroom. I'm going to be taking my students to a museum this weekend, and one of my students asked how they should dress, right? Do they need to wear business casual? And so that's not something I even thought about, that we're entering these spaces that for so long has felt very closed and very clubby, if you will. And so I think Smart History and the work that we're doing there is really an opportunity to make the study of art history, which has so long, been controlled by people who have their own collections, right? Making it more democratic, more accessible. In terms of, my work with Smart History and wanting to make it more equitable, my hope is that I can continue finding scholars to write on subject matters and on materials that often don't get included in art history, like textiles, materials that aren't considered fine art. They're not paintings, they're not sculpture, it's not architecture, it's not drawing, but textiles in particular are traditionally under the purview of women. So including conversations about textiles means that we're including women in the study of art history as makers and as producers. So I think this segues well into our next question, which is whose art history gets to be told and who gets to tell it? So I open the floor to Marika first.
Well, I don't think that I can provide an answer. I actually has questions as well for others and how they're dealing with these kinds of issues. As much as we want to expand what is being taught, what subjects are being discussed, there are kind of these structural systems in place that do make it hard sometimes to go beyond. So for instance, if we want to have, open access images, then we're going back to the same museum collections over and over again. Those tend to be in Europe and North America. And so we are sort of reinforcing the system whereby works of art have been brought out of their country of origin, have ended up in other museums, but that's what gets published and presented as the canonical examples of whatever topic in our fields, because it's museums in other countries, for instance, might not have the resources for the digital photography to have staffs where you can contact them and get permission to put things on websites. So it's just, I'm sorry not to answer your question exactly, Melody, but just to say these, for people out in the world who maybe don't understand why things can or can't change in the field, we have this in mind. We are wanting to see this change, but it's not always easy to implement. And if anybody has suggestions for working around this, I'd also love to hear them.
You bring up a really important point, Marika. Thank you for bringing that up.
as you were saying that, Marika, I had all of these examples in my own research and my own teaching and things of really exciting artworks and objects that I would love to teach, love to work on, but because of access and things like that, it's hard. And, you know, I'm coming from a very privileged place of within academia, and still of that idea of being able to bring these out to people who aren't, don't already have that access and those kinds of things, I think is a exciting idea of how we can change the field, but it's very difficult. And I also wanted to kind of highlight one of the things Melody said earlier about writing for smart history and kind of increasing that importance of public art history and public discourse. So engaging with and Lauren talked about this as well, engaging with the wider public and making this something that is valued within the discipline of writing for public scholarship. Because I think that is part of expanding out who's telling these narratives, but also engaging, you know, of that, like how many people read our articles, and engaging with a much larger public and having these conversations.
Am I up next? Forget where I am in the list. You know, I mean, in some ways, it's a very hard question to get to Marika's point. You know, that's something that just from the smart history side, we've had to grapple with, right? There are essays that we just can't publish because we don't have access to the images. And I think every single person on this screen has experienced that email from me being like, I would love to, but you know, or we've had to find unique ways of getting around that because, you know, images can be a challenge. And I think, you know, the other complexity of that sometimes is, you know, should we be showing things? Not just, you know, are we able to, but it's sometimes like, you know, should we? And even that can kind of be part of that larger conversation about whose art history gets to be told and who gets to tell it, right? And sometimes those lead to really complicated conversations or questions that, you know, I think on a case-by-case basis we have you know, we have to address. And, you know, so far we've been fairly successful at doing that. You know, I think that in terms of where all of us on the smart history team, you know, talk about very regularly and think about, you know, this in terms of this question, you know, this is part of what motivates us to reach out to individuals and partner with foundations. You know, as a not-for-profit, you know, we get money from grants, and sometimes that kind of steers us in different directions. And so, you know, we're always trying to find ways to invite more people into the conversation, to do exactly what I think, Kristen, you mentioned earlier, but I think this has come up in several other answers, which is to not have a monolithic way also of telling art history, right? Like if someone, this came up recently in a forthcoming Reframing Art History chapter, where one of the authors is Tlingit. And, you know, and the idea of like how he is talking about, you know, his cultural heritage, like his traditions and culture is very different than, say, how it has been framed in more traditional ways within the context of like an art history discipline. And like, how do we, you know, invite that to be happening as well, and making sure that we're making space for that, and also taking it very seriously, that, you know, how an art historian trained in this way, given all the complexities of the history of our discipline, is not overriding, you know, how people might talk about their own cultural heritage, and making sure that we're creating enough space for that to be happening too. And that's something that we try to do, you know, that's very much on the forefront of our minds in terms of how we're going about doing what we're doing behind the scenes.
I see that we have a couple questions. I kindly ask that you wait until after this little portion, and I'll open up questions. But Kristen, did you want to add anything?
Sure, there we go. Right, yeah. So such great points. My mind is going in a million different directions, but when I'm thinking, sort of about that question, when you first mentioned, whose art history gets to be told and who gets to tell it, sort of as a question, even, it seems like such a, it has that like that sage on the stage kind of feeling, right? It has that kind of way we used to teach art history, which was somebody stands at, and how many of us learned art history, standing at a podium and kind of being fed information. And, to kind of think about how Melody was talking about this idea, this sort of clubby kind of perspective that, sort of people have about art history as well. But really, I think what we're sort of looking for is more of a collaborative art history, something that involves all of these different voices, right? And really respects and sort of invites sort of everybody into this kind of very messy, very imperfect kind of cacophony of human experiences. And that's kind of what we're looking at these objects to understand better as well. So I think, we're also grappling a little bit with this question of how to talk. It's not just about what content to include, but also how to talk about it and who to talk, all of these different pieces, and how to deal with these sort of more sensitive and difficult and important kind of issues that we all sort of face, intersecting with different identity politics and sort of cultural concerns, and really having these kinds of critical conversations about which stories we tell, not just the choice of them, and not just, and of course, like dealing with the images and all of these different kinds of things that makes it a little bit harder. But I think really keeping central to this idea that we're looking to build this equitable world. We're looking for what do humans need to do? What do our students need? What do all learners really sort of who are interested in engaging with this cultural material? How are we going to get to that place of more compassion, more empathy, to have these kinds of conversations that are difficult? And so I think, and sort of making the choices that, even just I was thinking about this in regard to the textbook that many of us are working on, and thinking about which images to include or which artworks to discuss, and thinking a little bit about where are we right now? What are the questions that are kind of coming up in our own conversations? And that may be very personal, but it's of course always very personal. I mean, that's what art is, right? So, this idea of making selections that aren't always the iconic works, aren't always the people that you expect to be talking, or even thinking more broadly about new relationships that sort of are forming between them. And I think that idea of really this very collaborative, this very conversational, this very sort of open it up and reinvestigate and keep looking, and lots of perspectives. And I think that idea of expansion, sort of sitting at the center of it. That's really when I think about who is talking. It's not really just one voice, it's a conversation always. So.
Yeah, you make a really great point. And, for me as a content editor for the Southeast Asia region, it's important for me to include voices from people from the region. Right now we're working with an emerging scholar from Indonesia, who's getting his PhD at SOAS, Pangga Ariandai Saya. And he's bringing, to Smart History, these sites and monuments that I never learned about in my years in school. And so he's telling the stories of monuments that are important to the region, but have not been important to Europeans and Americans in the study of Indonesian art. And I think that's a really important way that we at Smart History can include voices, right, of others, and precisely as Lauren said, working with a Tinglet author, the cultural sensitivities with which they speak to their monuments and objects as well, that we don't necessarily have as scholars with our book learning. So that's always important. I wanted to ask you, our speakers today, if there was any lingering comments that you'd like to add before we open up questions to our audience. Questions or comments from you guys before I start taking questions from the audience. No? Okay, so I'd love to get questions from the audience. If you could please put your questions in the chat. That way I can ask the panel speakers of them. I see that we have one question already. This comes from Megan Neely. The question is, there are so many institutional blocks to deconstructing the canon, the image problem that Marika mentioned being a significant one. Do you all envision a way to make smart history even more accessible by opening it up to other disciplines to show how interdisciplinary and collaborative the subjects really are? So that's the first half of Megan's question. The second half is perhaps utilizing YouTube channel for more open conversation, slightly less academic, but still with an interest of expansion. So sort of a comment. So if anyone would like to tackle Megan's question first.
That might be a question that I can answer.
Yeah.
At least try to. So, I mean, the first one is, to say that, at this point, Smart History is more than 600 collaborators. And there are about 4,000 videos and essays. So, and I say that mainly because even those of us who are, within it all day long, we forget about things. And so I mentioned that because, we are and have partnered with people from different disciplines. It might not be as transparent, and obviously art historians are still a very key component, but I mean, there have been historians, archaeologists, we've had, elders from different indigenous traditions, we've had conservators, we've had many different folks. I think that, we are, art, the histories of art are definitely our kind of center point. So like we're not at this point planning on having like music history or things that are kind of maybe really separate. But I know that when Smart History was, in its origins, 20 years ago, and as it's grown in different iterations since then, that Beth Harris and Stephen Zucker, the co-founders of Smart History, always hoped that other disciplines would kind of see the success of Smart History and take up that project and do something similar. And unfortunately, there hasn't been as great of success for other disciplines in doing that. But I think that's always the hope, and finding ways of sharing and collaborating. But we are a small team of 5 full-time folks, so I'm not sure we would have the capacity to bring in too many more disciplines beyond our own. And for the second question, in terms of, the YouTube channel, I mean, it is conversational, and, I'm not entirely sure I completely follow the question. In case anyone here is not aware of this, everything that is recorded to Smart History is done on site. So, we're not doing it from the comfort of wherever we are, we're there and we're seeing it in person and we're talking, and it's unscripted and it's between, experts, to kind of model that conversation, and then using the video as needed to make sure that we're helping people again along in that process. So if I have misunderstood the question, please let me know.
I mean, I'd also like to add, Lauren, that part of the success of Smart History is that there are all of these folks like Amanda, Kristen, Marika, and the 600 others who volunteer our time because this is something that we care about, right? Often we are not paid, sometimes we are, but for the most part, we have a dedication to our field and expanding it. And so that's part of the success. I think that, other disciplines will need that sort of momentum as well to get their platforms off. I want to go, we have a second question from Heather Creamer. Her question is, how has the Smart History mission as a whole evolved over the years? That's the first part of her question. The second part of the question from Heather is, how has the program evolved at LMU, and what impact has it had on art history at LMU? So it's first is a Smart History question, then it's a question of Smart History and LMU combined. So Amanda, I was wondering if you wanted to tackle part of that question.
So I can talk about the LMU question. I guess I don't feel like I'm I'm deep enough in the smart history side of things to answer that side, but I can answer the LMU side. I think we at LMU are a very small art history program. We have 4 of us full time, and 2 out of the 4 of us, Melody and I both write for Smart History. So we are, as a program, I think all of us are invested in it because we have a personal investment. We as a program are having very serious conversations over the past couple of years and continuing about the future of art history, of what our discipline looks like, what we value, what we teach, what our classes are required for our students. And those conversations are involving a lot of the stuff we are talking about here, of who and what are we covering? What art are we asking our students to study? How are we asking them to study it? What is required? What is not? How, this is promoting a more diverse and equitable art history. And so I think this is probably a conversation that every art history department in the country, around the world, is having, of how we evolve as a discipline. And I don't know if we have answers. I mean, of the 4 of us, Melody, if you want to add on, but we're working on it. And I think the equitable access of smart history is something that's part of how we're evolving this.
And I'd like to add as well, and to, sort of circle back to what Lauren was saying when she was introducing herself, was that art history textbooks are exorbitantly expensive. They're expensive because they get printed in color. They're expensive because getting permissions for those images costs the publishers money, right? So having an open platform like Smart History means that students who may not have wanted to take an art history, or might not have been able to take an art history class because the textbook is $200-300, right? That makes it available for a broader student body to access art history. So to your question, Heather, I think LMU, not just art history, but LMU, particularly the library, is very committed to this work of open access materials for our students. We have so many questions, so I'm going to keep going. Let me try to get to a 3rd question coming from Kim Richter. She wants to congratulate us on this amazing panel and all the panelists and our critical work. And she comments, critics, and she's not one of them, might ask if there is a limit to adding on more information continuously. There is always something that is left out. How can you counter such critics?
Do you like me to jump in on this one? So not to take Lauren's job for her here, but I can say, having gone through this process of editing, writing, rewriting many times on many essays and with many authors, I would say the central question that we're looking at here, whether it's some, object in the corner of a museum that nobody ever cares about, or some public art that nobody never noticed, or, something that's a canonical work that's been in every single textbook, we are always coming to it with the question of, why does this matter, right? Because we have a very small, whether it's a very short video, a couple minutes of a video, or a very short, like 800-word essay kind of a thing, or 1,200 word, I forget what the numbers are, the limits that we're working with. But in any case, we're always asking, why should we care, right? That's kind of at the central driving point. And what that may immediately, sort of upset so many of us. Of course, we should care about everything. But at the same time, you're right, there's this question of what goes in, what stays out. And I think that question begs us to always look, and always, that's also getting to the question of voices and perspectives that we're bringing in. Because if we're able to kind of think through not just the value of describing a new object, and then building out to its cultural relevance, then, now, whenever, we're talking about sort of taking a stance, and it's not a monolithic stance, but it's one, because we're many authors, right, in Smart History. And when we're putting this out, it's more than what a textbook will have, for sure. It's not just a paragraph on one canonical work, but it's intended to be something that is a starting point for dialogue, but never an ending point. So I think this idea of adding continuously, well, we're always going to have to go through that rigorous process of what are we going to include and what are we going to talk about and which essay am I going to write first? And that's answering questions that are coming to us from our students, from our peers, from our colleagues, from the why don't we have something like this, or why is this so important question? And then on the same lines, that idea of the inclusivity and this choice about what we put in and what we take out. Yes, we have thought about that a lot. We think about that every single day. And of course, I'm out of the classroom now. I'm not teaching anymore. I retired, but I still, of course, kind of, when I think about what things even to write about now, I'm still thinking about those same questions about what is coming up right now. How are we thinking about things differently? The ways that we even wrote about works that are on the SmartHistory site, even 5-10 years ago, are still being rewritten, right? We're still looking at those and rethinking those and putting them into new linking them in different ways as the site expands. We're linking sort of one essay to maybe a concept that's even now at this point in a different, geographical area maybe, or even different periods and things like that. So that idea of forging connection between fields, I think, is a really good one. And I think that that is one more way that we're trying to expand, is to draw some connections, not to make things comparisons and not to do the apples and oranges thing that is reductive at times, but really to open up those questions about what this study is all about, why we're doing this, right?
That question, Kristen, I'm totally jumping in, but what do we owe the canon, right? Like, I assume all of us have had these moments of, am I teaching this only because I feel like I should, because it's in all the textbooks, because it's part of the canon? Or am I teaching this because I really think this is important? And I think that's a continual reevaluation every semester, every time I teach, of what do I owe to the canon, if anything? And how does that serve my students?
I was just about to say literally the same thing, Amanda. It's like you tapped into my brain. And this is just the way that I think about teaching. And I think this guides a lot of what I do and how I think about now on SmartHistory is, when I was in the classroom, I always would think about, what is the student-centered approach? Like, what do they really need to know? And what are the objects I think will get a lot of pedagogical mileage, where we can prompt really important questions or conversations, versus what Amanda was just saying of what do I owe the canon? And part of that is the chip on my shoulder as someone who cares very deeply about Latin America and the Americas more broadly, to see how often it's either really kind of minimally included in kind of surveys, whether that's courses or textbooks, but also, how it's kind of certain parts of it are, you get the conquest happens and then you get Diego Rivera and you're like, but hundreds of years of important and amazing things, but that are also just really important for now. And so I think whenever I'm teaching and thinking about, where do I want to see SmartHistory go, is guided by that kind of questions of what is pedagogically rich and what will prompt conversations and what would be useful for people in the classroom who are now being often asked to teach in a more globally oriented approach, who never took classes in areas that they're now being asked to teach. And this gets to the point of what multiple people have mentioned of just, how do we have these really difficult conversations about topics that are facing all of us, whether in the discipline of art history, or let's face it, just in our lives personally, in places like the United States today. How do we have conversations about race and gender and censorship and all these things, where it's become more challenging to do that. And so thinking about, objects that might be completely not part of the canon, but that can really prompt those conversations, I think guides much of what what we do also at Smart History, what we always tell people is like, choose an object that tells a really important and good story. And that to us is like the most important part, not whether it resides anywhere in a larger, the larger canon of sorts.
I'd like to continue. We have a number of questions. This comes to us from Kimberly Miner. She says, we've discussed building an equitable art history by selecting diverse content, but what kind of questions can we use to present these artworks / ancestral beings in the classroom? The second part of her question is, will Smart History integrate guiding questions for current or future artwork so students can build their confidence studying unfamiliar artworks? Would anyone like to take that question first?
I'm happy not to answer it first, but I have a feeling that I might have to answer part of it. I'm sorry. I'm happy to have anyone else answer the first question if you like.
Go for it, Lauren.
It's a great question, Kimberly, and it brings back something that, just because this is a short roundtable, not having enough time to talk about too many things in great depth, but several people have mentioned the Reframing Art History project, which is this board digital textbook, for lack of a better term. And I think that's where we are kind of creating these pathways. I mean, like I said, we have about 4,000 things on the website. It's hard to find things sometimes, even to me, if you don't know what you're looking for, right? And so how can we, again, help people at least have a foothold into feeling, they now are having an expert write, kind of glue things together in a way that makes sense, where you can go and read and be like, oh, this is actually really similar to what I'm familiar with, in this context. I wasn't aware of those connections, right? And so within the context of those chapters, there are guiding questions that are designed to kind of stay on the page to kind of help orient readers and to reflect. As far as integrating guiding questions for every essay and video, that's not something that we're currently, able to do. That doesn't mean that there aren't. I think where you can find some of that on the website is in the Seeing America project as well, which is its own thing, but also all the content is in the broader histories of art. But there are teaching guides, there are discussion questions, there are prompts for further research, and so I think that's where we've had some ability to do that kind of work. But there's I think as has kind of come out in the conversation, I think also with Smart History being very iterative and the ability to kind of grow and adapt, it's we're able to kind of we focus less on like teacher guiding resources, if that means like lesson plans and things, largely because as things are changing, then that means that those things have to change as well. And so that is something that for several complicated reasons are a bit more challenging for us to do. I'll let someone else tackle the first part of the question.
So the second part of the question, I think you kind of answered that as well, Lauren, which was, integrating those guiding questions. So in respect of the time, it's now 1:16 for all of our participants, but also for all of our attendees. We're just going to answer one last question before we say goodbye. And this question comes from Isabella Landry. And her question is, how can you expand Smart History for younger generations learning about art history and in their art classes in school before college? I can try to tackle this first. Isabella, many of the art history essays cover material that's actually in the AP curriculum, AP art history. So I can say that a number of my essays I've written specifically because I knew that they would be on the AP exam. And then certainly, Smart History does not limit itself. It's a free and open resource on the internet, so anyone can access it, whether or not they are in college or not. And I know that many of my students have come to LMU saying, I've read your work prior to coming to LMU. And so it gives me a little mini celebrity, right? Which I will take before they even come to LMU. If anyone wants to chime in on that question from Isabel, please do so. Yeah, Kristen.
I would say thank you for that question too, because the thing is that I think everybody thinks that this is just something we use and you know, at the college level, and that's absolutely not the case. I think so many people kind of use Smart History as a resource, even just the videos. I know this because just last night I showed my middle schooler a video on Tenochtitlan in the building of Templo Mayor. So these are things that actually are accessible at a lot of different ages. And I think that's these are things that just I'm grateful that they're out there. And I'm also grateful that they are bringing art history classes to high school levels even as well, because this was not something that was even an option when I was in high school. Art history is very rarely offered, sometimes an AP art history class, maybe at some schools, but not all of them. And many people don't find out about art history at all until they get to college. And even then, maybe not at all. So it might be because they went to a museum. It might be because they were traveling somewhere. There are a lot of different ways to kind of access this material. And I think, you know, that idea is very much at the forefront of my mind when I'm writing as well.
Well, thank you to you ladies. I hope that we see each other in person soon. Thank you for everyone who joined us today and for your thoughtful questions. I apologize that this format was only an hour long, but hopefully this is just a springboard for future in-person conferences or partnerships. If you're learning about Smart History for the first time but are interested in writing for Smart History, please contact Lauren or one of the content editors if you are working in one of our fields. So Amanda works on classical Greek and Roman material. Kristen works on Chinese and Korean material. I do Southeast Asia, and Marika works on the Islamic world. So thank you to you all, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks.